Hi, I'm Danny Flamberg, and I lead the HCP team at LiveWorld. If you're like me, you've been following the enormous and dramatic increase in the use of social media by HCPs. So today we thought we'd put together some of my favorite people to have a conversation about this and to illuminate what's going on, what it means, and how it fits into your non-promotion plan. To join me to start, I've invited our medical director, Dr. Umar Siddiqui, who is a surgeon and a tech consultant, kind of a double threat, and who is very active on social media himself. Umar?
Always a pleasure to join in, Danny. Thank you.
Joining us is Johanna Skilling, a well-known pharma marketer who's previously been EVP and chief strategist at a number of marquee agencies, and who also happens to be the all-star professor of the NYU Healthcare Communications Department. Johanna?
Hi, Danny. Hi, Umar. Happy to be here. Thank you for asking me.
So now let's talk about this. Johanna, how has the pandemic changed the positioning, the posture, and the usage of social media by HCPs?
Well, Danny, look how it's changed the use of social media by all of us. HCPs are no different. Every big platform has recorded a huge spike, not just in physicians joining, but how often they use it and even how engaged they are on the platform and the kind of enthusiasm they have. We've seen a gigantic rise in telehealth and the use of every kind of tool. So just like the rest of us who are kind of locked down, HCPs have got to figure out how to see patients, how to keep care alive, how to talk to each other. And they're doing it online in a way that's accelerated social media probably 10 years in the last 6 months.
So how do pharma marketers who traditionally have thought of social media as a secondary, maybe even a tertiary channel, how do they embrace this and how do they use it in a strategic kind of way?
Well, you know, a lot of them are really doubling down. Budgets have gone up for many for social media, where it's coming down from very traditional media. But not everybody is really set up internally to do it in the way and the nuances that all the different platforms require. So what pharma marketers need to start thinking about a little differently is not using the same information they might use for print or one banner across all platforms. They're going to have to really start thinking about Facebook versus Twitter versus Sermo versus Figure One as very different approaches so that they can reach HCPs in the ways that they most appreciate.
So Umar, you are our representative HCP. So could you talk about how you personally have used social media and then talk about how it's affecting your peers?
So without a doubt, COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the value of social media for HCP outreach, but it's a two-way conversation. So HCPs primarily have two outlets for social media: the public platforms, as we know, day-to-day, your Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn activities, of course, Facebook groups, and then also your peer-oriented closed platforms that are more specialized for healthcare conversations. So healthcare providers are more looking at online communities, boards, forums for information gathering, information sharing. I could relate to that. So whether it's with regards to a new drug, a case that they're managing, or a professional opportunity or direction where they're seeking in their careers, it's no longer about just self-directed education, training, or CME courses. That was yesterday. Today, it's more about building your brand, creating awareness for your practice, and then likewise connecting with your peers.
So how has this information sharing been affected by the COVID pandemic? We all kind of understand that the treatment schemes, the use of different drugs, the different kind of protocols are changing. Are these being exchanged on social media?
They are. So interestingly, social media, at least in the healthcare space, is kind of broken down to two ways: the traditional old way of relying on your KOLs, and then now you have your digital social media influencers that have stepped up in the healthcare space, whether from the nursing, the provider, or even your health evangelist. So therefore, it's kind of a bit of a balance where you have your science-backed research, your traditional academic-backed point of views and thinking, but then also now you have your technology evangelists, also individuals that are more of influencers creating awareness around a particular bit of news, a soundbite, or to start vocalizing more for policy changes that are required. So that's where we're seeing a lot of that conversation now come out of COVID-19 that previously we did not have.
So Johanna, the the pandemic seems to be kind of kicking over the checkerboard in terms of traditional ways of marketing to HCPs and traditional reverence for key opinion leaders. I get the impression that there are influential, self-appointed influencers who are getting the same amount of traction and credibility as classic KOLs. Are you seeing that as well?
Absolutely. Now, the classic KOLs aren't going away because they're there for a reason, but they're a very, very small fraction at this point of all the influencers that Umar started mentioning. So, Danny, I know you're familiar with ZDogg, who has hundreds of thousands of followers, and he got popular by playing music and adding a little lift to what he was talking about. There are others like a Seattle pediatrician who has 7,000 followers. So she's more of a micro-influencer, but she has a voice with her followers, and that's the kind of change that we're seeing. It's also interesting that younger doctors, especially those under 35, have a little less reverence for, the gray-haired wisdom keepers, of old. They're more in tune to the younger, more hip doctors, the TikTok docs, the people who are a little more irreverent and who might feel more like peers and who might feel more authentic to what they're feeling.
So the acceptance of social media, the use of social media, not only has been accelerated by the pandemic, but there were underlying changes in demographics, underlying changes in workflow, underlying changes in employment patterns, underlying changes in how practices operate and who owns practices that also contribute to this phenomenon. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, of course. So, it blew me away that 70% of HCPs right now are digital natives, and that number is obviously just going to get higher. So where people who are older they're still digital. I mean, 80% of doctors are on social media. In general, 90% of millennials are. So you see, that little bit of an uptake. The real difference is that they've grown up with Snapchat, with Twitter, with, now TikTok, with Twitch, with platforms that probably we haven't even heard of and that haven't even been invented. So the difference is going to be the style and the type of communication they're comfortable with and familiar with. They're a lot more open to humor. They're a lot more open to, lightheartedness. I already mentioned, the TikTok doc and all the dance moves. So that kind of style is a little hard for pharma. And of course, there's all the regulatory concerns that we have to be aware of, but that's a shift. Demographically, you mentioned not only are they younger, they're much more diverse. So in 2018, only about half of medical school graduates identified as white. That's a big change even from 10 years ago. 60% are women. So, when you see a portrait of a doctor as an older gray-haired white man versus a portrait who is a younger woman of color, that's a very distinct description of two different generations of doctors. So it's not just the visuals, that's the easy part. It's the language, it's the influences, it's the belief systems, all of which we have to become conversant in to empathize with where they are and who they are.
So Umar, if we're trying to reach this younger, more diverse, more demanding cadre of HCPs, what's the mix of platforms? Should we talk to them in a different way on Facebook than we do on Sermo? How should we as marketers think about communicating the message, and what channel should we think of in terms of a media mix?
Absolutely. So it seems like each platform serves a different purpose for a healthcare provider. Some people are seeking catharsis from their day-to-day. Some people are seeking camaraderie, a connection with their past peers and cohorts. And then the others, crowdsourcing, in the sense of just like how we're looking for recommendation of who I could get to move my furniture, providers are looking for advice on their case, a recommendation in terms of a med review, things like that, or they'll be able to upload an image. So it's good to break down, first of all, to see what is public facing, open communities, and then also what is closed, like the walled gardens that we know of that are HCP invite only communities where more private, intimate conversations are going out. So once again, as we said, HCPs need that cathartic outlet, whether to vent and lurk, because as we know, direct patient care day to day, it's not getting any easier hand in hand with dealing with your payers, providers, health system, ecosystem. Also, in other areas where you could target the community, in terms of these invite-only groups, such as on Facebook. There are various Facebook groups there, within Twitter, where it evolves into an invite-only community, and obviously the closed communities such as your Sermos, your Doximities, and your Skiptas, which are much more specialized and honed in. You need more of that crafted, curated message. So whenever HCPs are engaging with the social media, you have to see what kind of social media it is first and foremost, and then second of all, have a little bit more personalized, curated, and crafted to what they're seeking.
It sounds to me that one of the key dimensions, not only in choosing a channel, is understanding kind of a mentality that younger HCPs don't want the information spun, they don't want the information packaged, they want the basic facts. They're reluctant to take medical or clinical advice from reps, and they seem to be saying, give me the data, I will interpret it. Don't pre-digest it for me, don't spin it for me, don't explain it to me, let me do that on my own. Has that been your experience?
For myself? Yes, exactly. So yes, with the newer generation, more digital savvy, more crowdsource oriented, HCPs of the future, you could say, are millennials, post Gen X. They are much more receptive to peer reviewed. And when we mean peer reviewed, we're just not talking standardized academic research coming from a known entity that's been validated and everything, but more of their cohort, people that they have trained with, to be able to take that data, as you said, and process it, interpret the way they want. Versus the old guard, you know, you could have those endless white papers, the endless invitation-only webinars where you kind of discuss one-on-one with your pharma life science representative in terms of the benefits, the research behind it. So it's just more of an open-minded approach now to be able to look at different sets of data, different sets of information, and be influenced.
Johanna, have you been surprised at the level of clinical data and information shared on the public platforms, the growth of private Facebook groups, the sharing of scans and data sets on Twitter, where HCPs in a kind of public forum can share diagnosis, share interpretations, share the data?
You know, it's an interesting question, because just the way Umar was talking about wanting peers to relate to each other, just as we are in many ways all in our media bubbles, so are doctors. The sharing of information is very much a reaction to a huge wave against the misinformation, especially around COVID, but scientific misinformation, and doctors, and particularly younger doctors, but all of them are outraged. And so I think what many doctors are trying to do is influence their patients and their communities about what's real, what they can believe, and put themselves, you know, in the vanguard of people who are saying, this is scientific truth, this is fact, and I'm somebody who believes it. And if you believe me, then let's get on board together with this.
So one element of the social media universe, and maybe it's not even social media universe, are platforms that have begun to become very popular that we think of as point of care platforms, starting with electronic health records, but also things like Figure One, Up to Date, Hippocrates, where HCPs access these platforms in the moment to gather information, to help solve a case, to figure out prescribing or dosing. Are they social media, or how should we think about them?
Well, a little bit of both, right? So Skipta and not up to date, forgive me, Figure One, very much social media because it's shareable, which is one way to define social media. EHR, not so much. Hippocrates, not so much. You can share it, but you're sharing from your own platform instead of within the platform. I'd make that distinction. That said, you know, a lot of marketers have been using EHRs for a few years because they're right there in the moment of the workflow. They're right there when you're making a judgment about a case. Same thing with Hippocrates or Up to Date. Doctors will use them in the course of an appointment to double check something. So being there in that moment of care is critical for marketers, regardless of whether it's social or not. And the fact that you can work with these platforms to elevate your brand at the moment that it might be needed is really important to help doctors make the right decision.
So given the changes in the psychodemographics of the target audience and the adoption of these channels, what's the advice to content makers? Do we need to talk to HCPs differently than we're used to? Do we need to use different memes? Do we need to use different tools? Or do we just go to our traditional Slim Jims and Viz Aids and key traditional tools?
You know the answer to that. So we have to be different because the medium is different. It's interactive, it's fun, it's visual, it's quick. So, we can't be doing Slim Jims on Twitter. Now, I know about ISI and Fair Balance, and there are very clever ways to deal with that. But we have to look at this medium differently, and it's taken pharma so long to get into digital at all. Now it's that next leap forward of really thinking about content visually, dramatically. Video is not just about talking heads. Here we are, but there's more to it than that. And it's getting into all the different tools and reactions and things that we can do. So unfortunately, it's not easy because on Facebook versus Sermo or Twitter versus Skipta, doctors use very different language and they talk, as Umar suggested, about really different things. On top of that, they're not as interested in the spin, as Umar said, that pharma gives. 57% of doctors said they don't feel understood by pharma in the era of COVID. So pharma is not taking into account their experiences, and that's in the moment, let alone the clinical nuances. Sermo did a super interesting study comparing them in Twitter. It was a few years ago, but you could see on Twitter, it was mostly about problem solving for patients. And on Sermo, it was mostly about problem solving for cases and for doctors. So how brands choose to communicate has to be very thoughtful.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. It also changes the calculus about reps. Some of the recent research has discovered that there's kind of been a mismatch between the expectations of HCPs and reps. Reps thought their job was to go and explain the data, make clinical points, and sell in treatment options. Doctors expected the reps to do very practical things like show up with samples, copay cards, patient information materials. So in some cases, the two were kind of passing ships in the night. Now we've got access issues, which are finessed by telehealth and by things like Zoom, but it forces us to talk in different ways. It forces us to think in different ways. It forces us to create a different set of materials. So Umar, and I'll ask Johanna this question as well. So what are the marching orders for pharma marketers? What do we learn from this phenomenon of social media and the rise of social media as both a credible and constant source of information for HCPs? What advice would you give? What imperatives would you give to pharma marketers based on what we're watching and what we're seeing? Umar?
So I think pharma marketeers need to realize and understand and comprehend what is really driving these healthcare conversations around the HCPs. As we know, they're drawn to the clinical case sharing, reviewing of drugs, and dialogue on what's going on in the healthcare ecosystem, if not professional development even for themselves. Information can be ascertained through polls, surveys, promotions, and other activities to increase engagement. But end of the day, pharma and life science marketeers really need to center around empathy and the experience and their approach towards social media where HCPs are engaging. By being empathetic, it's just not just towards the patient and the journey, but empathetic to the HCP and their daily life. HCPs come to social media as an outlet and refuge. So to further the dialogue, the discussion, the discourse with HCPs, you really have to design emotion around the communication, and messaging is the key all around this. So make it look and feel different rather than from your traditional data dump or your antiquated research or white paper. It really should be an experiential outlet for the HCP.
Johanna, what advice would you give to pharma marketers?
Well, I want to first start by agreeing with Umar. Empathy is so key. Doctors are so battered, and even the ones that aren't directly treating COVID have to deal with business issues and practice changes and safety for their patients and concern to patients and when will they get the vaccine. So the idea of empathy has always been important, never more now. Second thing I would say is really think about the tools of digital. It really goes beyond, a social media campaign. It's a Facebook approach, it's a Twitter approach, it's a Sermo approach, it's a Figure One approach. And what are your HCPs using and how are they using it and how do they like to engage? And the third thing I'd say is take advantage of those channels with all the different tools and opportunities that they have to be a little different, to be a little more visible, to be quick and concise, but powerful. in a way that people will really want to share and amplify, because it's not enough to put it out there. People have to really resonate with it. And what makes it social? Because people want to share it with their friends and colleagues.
So we've got to be empathetic. We have to think about the experience and the journey. We have to be transparent. We have to put the data on demand. We've got to be sensitive to both the psychodemographics and the work situation of HCPs. And we've got to embrace the functionality and the uniqueness of each of the social media platforms. I think you've
Well said.
got a menu of things to do. I hope you've learned something or heard something you didn't know before. If you are particularly interested in this topic, please ping us and we'll be happy to share a white paper or some data for you to interpret on your own. All you have to do is send an email to hello@liveworld.com. We hope you've learned something. We hope you embrace social media, and we look forward to talking to you again. Bye.